once it starts from a limited set of strikes to, gets closer to a full-on invasion, say, the responsibility, the power, the authority that you have is completely changed. And then you are brought back in to this period of perceived Western interventionism, which for the UK is also in a site of a former colony in the British Protectorate of Aden. So it can bring back all of those concerns of the West, interfering in people and interfering in ways when that's exactly the type of ideological battle that states are trying to put you in. They're trying to say that you have no respect for law and order, that you have no respect for international norms and values, because you're saying this and doing another.
And from a purely military objective, Matthew, how effective have these airstrikes been? I mean, Rishi Sunak apparently has just said in the Commons that all 13 targets have been destroyed. Is that going to be enough to deter the Houthis?
No, they won't be deterred. They won't be deterred until they have just one last man, one last team.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the situation in the Red Sea with Dr. Matthew Hedges, an expert in security studies and authoritarian regimes. Matthew is also the author of Reinventing the Sheikhdom, Clan, Power and Patronage in Mohammed bin Zayed's UAE. And back in 2018, whilst conducting fieldwork research for his PhD in the United Arab Emirates, he was arrested, tortured and sentenced to life imprisonment under the charge of espionage. He was subsequently pardoned and released. Dr. Matthew Hedges, thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's begin with a bit about the Houthi rebels, who they are, and crucially what their role has been in Yemen over the past decade or so.
Sure. So the Houthis are, to their core, they are an extended family. They have grown from not even a nuclear unit, but somewhat of a meta family. They transcend the tribal dynamics within Yemen, and they've done this through the use of religion, through the creation of a political party, Ansar Allah, which you may have often heard the Houthis being referred to. So in this regard, the Houthis are both that core family unit to which leads the political party, but also the political party itself. And so it's easy to confuse the two terms, but to make sure that people understand there are certain distinctions, there are descriptors within them which might refer to a single aspect of the group. So yes, they are a family. Yes, they are at least at the executive, at the top level. Whereas the broader consensus, the broader membership are part of a political unit, but they also are increasingly aligning around an Iranian-inspired theocratic model of governance. And this is something which is directly at odds with Yemen, because Yemen is a heavily tribal society. It's old, it's cultivated, and since the end of the civil war, it's kind of renewed its social political interaction between itself. So when the Houthis, for decades they were fighting the central government as well as Saudi Arabia, they were, might as well have been mountain rebels. Could easily forget about them, but this continued, and Iran saw a cheap opportunity through which to secure a foothold for themselves on the base of the Arabian Peninsula. As a result, the Houthis have turned from this group of mountain rebels, of an extended family, into something which is now effectively governing the totality of North Yemen. And this is because they have been able to transmute, they've been able to extend their family operation, like a mafia, into something which incorporates some of the formal structures of tribes. It incorporates the different religious views, and it does so under a single umbrella, either through reward or through coercion.
And clearly, for the last 10 years or so, they have been at the centre of a massive conflict in the region because they've been at war with a Saudi-led coalition. Bring us up to speed with where that conflict is now, Matthew.
Sure. So the Houthis, after the Arab Spring, they effectively contested power with the long-term dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. This led to a long and drawn-out coup. And once they actually physically took power within the capital, Sana'a, Saudi Arabia, as well as the UAE and some other Gulf states, initiated a war with the intention and objective to remove the Houthis from power. This started in 2015. We are now in 2024. The Houthis are not just still in power, they are stronger than they've ever been. They've shown this by being able to attack Israel, the land itself, ships. They have the ability to impact and influence international shipping, international security. They have been able to withstand the pressure of years of sanction, years of attacks, and, they are simply gaining in strength and authority. There is no true competitor domestically within Yemen to the Houthis. The Yemeni government is weak, it's split, and it holds maybe two or three governments which are spread across the country and are at high risk of capture from either the Houthis or in South Yemen from the Southern Transitional Council, who are backed by the UAE, which, if that were to happen, then Yemen would effectively split. And that certainly does seem to be the way in which the country is going. The idea of Saudi Arabia, it's been left by itself because the Emiratis left the conflict saying that they had completed their military operation. They still have military units there, but they aren't for the Saudi military objectives, they're for their own military objectives. They have started to diverge away from the idea of a single united Yemen because the Houthis are so strong and in power in North Yemen, that the realistic, the reasonable perception is that you cannot remove them. So you have to now think of a different parameter through which to work with. The Saudis want to position a federal type state or a confederation where there's a Houthi controlled third, there's a government controlled third, and there's a Southern Transitional Council controlled third of the country. But they're still working together with the Houthis, who are, conducting these terrorist attacks. And there was a peace agreement in advanced stages held by the United Nations after the Houthis' increase in shipping and piracy. This is now nearly completely undermined and destroyed, as no one can take the word of the Houthis seriously, nor could they work with them.
We're going to come on to the latest situation in the Red Sea in just a moment, Matthew. But when we talk about the Houthis, particularly in recent days in the media, people talk about the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. So just talk to me about their links to Tehran and what kind of support does the Iranian regime provide them with?
Sure. So as I briefly mentioned, the Houthis weren't, from their inception, from their creation, they were not an Iranian ally. But they have, out of a shared relationship, out of a shared enemy, they have grown in stature together. And this has, in turn, evolved into a near, it's not even a proxy relationship anymore. It's more direct than this. It's direct. The Houthis would not have been able to do or to conduct the attacks that they have done. They would not be able to hold on to power the way they have done in North Yemen without direct Iranian support. And this has been cited nearly every year by the United Nations for Iran accused of sending weapons to Yemen. Ships are confiscated, smugglers have been intercepted. We've seen evidence of another Iranian proxy, Hezbollah. They've sent their soldiers and trainers to go to Yemen and to train the Houthis into using advanced weaponry. They have helped them maintain aircraft. So all of a sudden, out of this war, the Houthis have been able to maintain helicopters and jets and start flying them again. But this is after a period of several years. And these evolutions, these developments only show the success that Iran and its other proxies are having when compounded and when directed towards Yemen. It is why ballistic missiles were used so effectively against Saudi Arabia, against the UAE, when they were hitting oil infrastructure, airports, and hence there was a very quick discussion to try and calm those tensions. But now again, this group, which were a decade or so before, quite literally mountain soldiers, now able to go and fire ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, UAVs. They're able to not just fire them and in some cases have some success, but also even undertake the industrial process to create them, to go and get civilian parts to put together a UAV, which can be used to attack a ship, to undertake an airborne raid from a helicopter and to hijack a ship. These are very clear instances of direct Iranian involvement in this. The issue with Iran comes, you have the Iranian state and you have the Revolutionary Guard, which is a parallel state. They are, of course, still one and the same, but it is the IRGC that is front and center at this. We've seen Houthi figures go to Iran often and meet with their Iranian counterparts. We've seen Iranian figures, at least discreetly, turn up in Yemen. We've seen Houthi soldiers martyred, killed, fighting alongside the other Iranian proxy Hezbollah. We've seen them killed in Syria as part of their field training. So there is an absolute commonality, there is a merger of those networks, of which the Houthis would not have been able to get to where they are now without this Iranian support.
That brings us on to the situation we've been seeing in the last, few months in the Red Sea, with the Houthi rebels attacking commercial shipping. And of course, we know how important the Red Sea is as a commercial shipping lane. Are they doing that almost to deliberately provoke the West?
Oh, 100%. It is part of a broader ideological, a narrative battle, if that's the best way to discuss it, whereby the US in particular is standing so vehemently behind Israel, regardless of the perceived injustices that Israel is committing in Gaza, regardless of the perceived abuse of international law. And so when the Houthis attack commercial shipping, when they hijack ships, or when Iran does this, there's a perception that you cannot criticize us because you are no better. So Iran is doing this, the Houthis are doing this to not only demonstrate their own authority and power, but to also test the integrity of Western states. If the US and the UK, who are the particular antagonists in firing weapons against the Houthis, if they claim to be doing this on the defense of international law and order, well, why are you doing this here, but then you're not applying this towards Israel? It's a way to deliberately twist and use the words against them. Why are you doing this to us when you can see what's happening in Gaza? You can see how it's so easily weaponized especially when Iran is putting this through it's called that pan-Islamic narrative, where it's a global war against Muslims, against Islam. And so you then see you would see communities, they become more polarized. It's such an emotional topic. And absolutely, there are reasons, credible reasons for this. But there's also a deliberate act that the Houthis are doing, knowing that a reaction will come. By attacking certain ships in certain places, they know that this is endangering the international security. They know it's going to be impacting states across the world. This isn't just impacting Israel. It started off by attacking Israel and some specific ships linked to Israel, but is now completely incorporated, international shipping altogether. Now, the red line, which prompted the US and the UK to attack the Houthis, was not, in my mind, the large number of missiles and UAVs that targeted a US ship last week, I believe. This was not the red line. The red line was Iran hijacked an oil tanker off the coast of Oman. Because it is one thing for a non-state actor, the Houthis, to do this and to continue doing it, but Iran doing it and to do it off the coast of an allied state was a complete that was the immediate point of response, and hence why it was several hours after this when the attacks on the Houthis came.
Which I suppose begs the question, if the Houthis were actively trying to provoke a conflict with the West, are these airstrikes that we've been seeing in the last week or so going to make any difference? I mean, even today we've had reports of a UK vessel being targeted near the Yemeni port city of Aden. If that's not deterring them, what will?
Yeah, so you have the attack on a British ship near Aden, you have attacks against a US ship as well today. These initial attacks were neither small enough, which could be brushed off as a symbolic gesture, nor were they big enough where they could be seen as having a crippling effect on the Houthis. It is actually much more a fundamental question that's being put at play here. It's the idea of the international order of this. Well, it's not so much a unipolar world anymore. It's a bipolar world, maybe a multipolar world. But if the West says, and it will stand up for certain rights, if it will stand up for certain principles, unless you follow through with that, your words are meaningless. So it's a test. It's a test because if the UK and US wasn't to do this, how would this enable China, Russia, Iran to do this further? The UAE with its work in Sudan, Saudi Arabia with its own expansion, how would they then interpret the West's strong words if they have no intention of actually following it up? There has to be a degree of payment. If you keep saying that we're going to do this, but you never do, it's kind of the boy cried wolf. But what the limited number of attacks, or the limited volume of what has happened so far, does indicate that there will be more to come. That it wasn't really ever going to stop the Houthis from attacking. Because also they don't have to attack ships. They can attack Western military bases within the region. They could attack, which they've done before in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Kuwait, in Bahrain. They are all targets, for response. But it's also critical here to mention the fact that, as we mentioned, the war with and how the Houthis have gotten to the power they have is because of the war initiated by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is nearly 10 years later. The group is there in a stronger position of power, and the West has been extremely reluctant to do anything. They've tried to support this process for peace because the last thing they want is to get brought back into the Middle East. So in the same way that they have to be showing the West to be strong, that they stand and mean for something, it's also the year of elections in London and in Washington. It's a way for Rishi Sunak, for Joe Biden, to turn around and say, look, we're being tested internationally. China is looking at Taiwan. It's thinking that maybe because we're not deemed strong enough anymore, we're not willing to stand up, that they could test us. Russia's tried it with Ukraine. We've pushed back. Maybe they don't feel as though we're serious enough. But Saudi Arabia and the UAE have failed to achieve their objectives in Yemen, so we now have to go in and clear up their mess. The reason that this can't be celebrated from the region is because it's diametrically opposed to the Houthis also supporting the Palestinian cause, which is something of a much more publicly unifying message. So they may criticize Western intervention again, but at the same time, they're celebrating it because it's trying to repair the damage that they've caused for nearly a decade.
I want to come on to the links between what we're seeing in the Red Sea and what we're seeing in Gaza in a moment, Matthew. But you mentioned Rishi Sunak there, of course, the UK Prime Minister. We should say at the time of recording, he's currently addressing the House of Commons about the situation in the Red Sea. And he says he wants to do everything he can to reduce tensions. But if you are the UK, if you are the US, how do you achieve that? How do we reduce tensions from here?
This has to be discussed. This has to be, you can't pretend. You're not dealing with the Houthis, you're dealing with Iran. Should Iran tell the Houthis to do something, they will do it. Iran has said on multiple occasions that it doesn't want an escalation. What they're trying to do is to get a stop to the war in Gaza. Now, we've seen Washington's inability to convince Israel into stopping or at least reducing its war in Gaza. But the two could realistically be seen as interrelated. Should there be a reduction in Israeli actions within Gaza, Iran could respond in kind. The Houthis, however, are not a trusted or reliable actor that you can negotiate with. They've shown this on multiple occasions, and they have nothing else to lose. Whereas for the West, the only way they can go is further and further and further in. Plus, it simply then gives you a responsibility. You've started this, so now you have to go and clean it up. So that's maybe why Rishi Sunak doesn't want it to go further, because once it starts from a limited set of strikes to, gets closer to a full-on invasion, say, the responsibility, the power, the authority that you have is completely changed. And then you are brought back in to this period of perceived Western interventionism, which for the UK is also in a site of a former colony in the British Protectorate of Aden. So it can bring back all of those concerns of the West, interfering in people and interfering in ways when that's exactly the type of ideological battle that states are trying to put you in. They're trying to say that you have no respect for law and order, that you have no respect for international norms and values because you're saying this and doing another.
And from a purely military objective, Matthew, how effective have these airstrikes been? I mean, Rishi Sunak apparently has just said in the Commons that all 13 targets have been destroyed. Is that going to be enough to deter the Houthis?
No, they won't be deterred. They won't be deterred. And, until they have any, just one last man, one last team. They were initially wholly dependent on imports from Iran and from Iran's network of smugglers. They have since been able to manufacture and develop weapons domestically. They've been able to train their own soldiers into firing them. There are also reports of Iranian or IRGC ships operating within the region, helping with intelligence and some of the reconnaissance. So they have all of the individual components. They're not really undertaking much damage, but it's the perceived threat that it's causing. This is what's most important here. So do they need to? They can't really be deterred because it's part of a much larger battle. Now, if I was to suppose or hypothesize a new scenario, just say that the Houthis, in response to these attacks, targeted ships within the Persian Gulf. They targeted ships around the Straits of Hormuz, along the Emirati coast opposite Iran. What you'll then be doing is demonstrating or expanding the international threat of shipping to not just one but two of these strategic choke points where an enormous amount of global trade runs through. If it's already increased shipping by 500%, say, just through the Red Sea, imagine what will happen if they are able to target and harass these two areas, not just one.
There is so much we could unpick in terms of the situation in the Red Sea with the Houthis. Just finally on the current situation, Matthew, where do you think this leaves Gaza and the potential for a ceasefire? I mean, it felt almost as if slowly the US and the UK were moving to a situation where they were increasing the pressure on Israel to, at the very least, scale back their military operations. If anything, does that now put that in jeopardy? Because surely there will now be a pressure for the West not to be seen to give in to the Houthis.
So you're correct. The pressure that the West and Israel is under now is time. It's always been time for Israel. But the time is also the public battle, the international courts of justice, Israel's answering, Israel's response to accusations of genocide. This is as important as Western pressure. Israel cannot realistically maintain the tenacity, the intensity of operations in Gaza without consistent help and supply from the West, at least certainly without incurring far more soldier casualties, something which it would not maybe be willing to accept. But you're right, it's how do you balance the demands of keeping up a battle to try and defeat a group or an organization which the Israelis have failed from the very start by stating that they wanted to defeat Hamas, and they were going to do so solely by military means. This is an impossible task. It is not something which they can do. This has been widely spoken about. The idea that if you may kill one Hamas soldier, but two more will replace them, of which it doesn't have to be Hamas, it can be a completely new group or identity. All you're doing is creating more and more sufferers. You're creating more and more people who are vindicated, who have a reason to fight. Now, for the West, who have publicly backed Israel throughout this, there does have to be limits. Now, the US has been, the UK has been more critical of Israel. The US has at least tried to be more balanced, at least in their mind. But this is coming to a head, and it's coming to a head very quickly. This is likely to be directly linked to the events in The Hague. But either way, it doesn't put the Netanyahu administration in a very good place, because they would have neither achieved their strategic goals nor been able to maintain international support, for their operations.
Before we finish, Matthew, I mentioned at the start of this interview that back in 2018, when you were researching your PhD, you were arrested, you were tortured, and you were sentenced to life in prison in the United Arab Emirates. And obviously, thankfully, you were subsequently pardoned and released. But I mean, this is something we could talk to for hours, and maybe at another point it would be good to go into it in the full depth it merits. But I just wondered, how are you now, and how do you reflect on what happened?
I'm better now, of course. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Every day I learn. I learn new things about myself. You learn through success, through failure. The fact I've been able to come here today to the studio is a positive for me. When I first arrived back, because I'd spent 7 months in solitary confinement, it was difficult for me to leave not just my house, but my bedroom within my house. Interacting with people is still a difficult task. I'm trying to learn to use my trauma, my experience for good for others. I'm doing a lot of work with NGOs such as Redress and Freedom from Torture. Some work with survivors of torture group. We've been putting through some different policies to government. I've also been utilizing my research speciality and experience to really focus on authoritarian regimes and state security organizations. It's been such a great way for me to amplify and unite my research experience and expertise along with a personal view of events. So, for example, I had been reviewing the UAE's operations in Yemen as part of my research, and that was how I had initially been brought into looking into Yemen. During my detention, I was also threatened with being renditioned to a secret military base in South Yemen, where I was told I'd never see the light of day again. I'd be beaten every day. And ever since, I've continued to keep an eye, and I've continued to research events in Yemen. And I know what has been going on in quite an intense detail. And I've just known from my return, I'm lucky because I'm alive, and I'm here to tell the tale when many others aren't. I've had support from others. So I do feel a huge responsibility to do as much as I can, whilst also trying to aid in conversations and debates as and where I feel it is suitable. And so here today, of course, the Houthi attacks on shipping is of huge international significance and importance. The physical impact they're having has been somewhat limited. I'm not trying to undermine them in the slightest. It's far more symbolic, but it's also a symptom of over a decade-long failure for the states that started this war to achieve their aims. This lies nearly entirely on Saudi Arabia, and this is because the Emiratis were very clever in removing themselves from the conflict. But by doing so, they've also initiated and demonstrated a very stark split and contrast between themselves and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wants to keep a united Yemen. The Emiratis are pushing hard for an independent South Yemen, and that's because they have invested a lot of money and time into developing this group of people. And I've over this time I've been able to see it's not just chess. You can see how strategically these policies, these networks are created and implemented over days, weeks, through cross industry. It's fascinating to see and to watch. And whenever I can do things to help others and try and inform, I do. I am continuing to push for justice. I have 2 criminal cases in France and Austria against Emirati individuals, including the president of Interpol, and I have a civil case open in London. And it keeps my drive and attention going to be able to seek accountability and justice. And I don't know if you remember, last year I also had an apology from the Foreign Office for their failure to protect me from torture, which I experienced in the UAE.
Well, Matthew, we really appreciate having you here with us today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.